Hello everybody and welcome. My name's Tim Rockwell and I'm the chairman of the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore Energy and Utilities Business Committee. This group's bringing you this event on developing a hydrogen economy, and it very much follows on from the events that we've had this year on a decarbonisation theme. We've looked at shipping, we've looked at the energy transition and finance, we've looked at the circular economy. Today we're looking at hydrogen. We've got more events coming up this year on waste to energy, carbon capture and storage, and a very special event that we'll announce shortly. This event's done in collaboration with the Sustainability Committee and is part of the Chamber's Road to Net Zero programme. I'm very pleased as well that the British High Commission and the British High Commissioner is on this call, and thank you very much to them for their participation. This event is run with the Energy Institute and the IPPF, who've helped support this event. So thank you to those members. I know that we're very much full to capacity on this webinar. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand over to Thomas. Thomas is from Arup. And Arup, of course, is part of the UK Hydrogen Task Force. We've got a lot of content, a lot of panelists to get through. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Thomas for the introductions and to take this panel forward. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Tim, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending this session, Developing a Hydrogen Economy, which is very applicable here in Singapore, but also across APAC and, of course, the wider world. As Tim said, thanks also to BritCham Singapore for organising this webinar in these challenging times and for collating this exciting panel for us this evening. So with us today, we have 5 interesting speakers. Her Excellency Cara Owen, British High Commissioner to Singapore. She'll introduce herself in a bit, but I imagine her focus will be on how to facilitate collaboration between the UK and Singapore and on how that fits with the UK's wider hosting of COP26. We have Deputy Director of Engineering and Research at the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, John Saltmarsh. John provides the government with engineering and scientific evidence and advice on how to decarbonise the UK's energy system and has focused on many hydrogen projects in the UK. Then we have Professor Chan of Nanyang Technological University, who focuses his research on fuel cells and hydrogen technologies, and will be telling us a little bit about Singapore's ambition as well as his own research at the university. We'll then hear from a practitioner in the oil and gas industry, Andreas Prozanecki, Senior Strategy Advisor at BP Australia. And then finally, we'll hear from Nigel Holmes, CEO of the Scottish Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association, about some of the exciting work they're doing in Scotland, with a particular focus on some of the transport sector. So thank you all for being here today. My name is Thomas Brio, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm leader of energy at Arup across Southeast Asia, and I've got a background in renewable energy and hydrogen. We'll hear from each of the panelists in a moment, and that will take us through 5 presentations till about 5 p.m. That's 10 a.m. UK time, and then there'll be a Q&A session which will last until 5:30. There's a Q&A function in your in the Zoom function there, so please do post your questions to the speakers there, and if there are any questions of particular interest, please like those to help us prioritize questions you'd like to hear answers to in particular. Before I ask the panelists to start, I'll give a quick, the briefest backgrounds to hydrogen in Singapore and the Asia-Pacific context to save them doing so. So bear with me for those of you that already know this. So as many of you know, hydrogen needs to be produced using a different form of energy. And in order for it to be created into a fuel, it can be created from the reformation of fossil fuels, blue hydrogen, when it's combined with carbon capture and storage, or it could be created from renewable electricity, what's known as green hydrogen. It is therefore an energy vector that can be used to decarbonize the fossil fuel industry or to transport and store renewable electricity. But by virtue of using a fuel to create it, it does come with an energy penalty. And that means that it costs money to produce, store, and transport. The point is that today the climate imperative has grown in importance to the point where society, or at least some parts of society, are willing to pay for that climate mitigation that it provides, and evidence of that can be seen in numerous feed-in tariffs and auction processes that result in carbon reduction around the world. The question really is how to produce and use it most cost effectively, what technology advancements are bringing down that cost, and what should be put in place to create a hydrogen economy as part of a wider energy system. In the context of Singapore, therefore, hydrogen provides an opportunity to import ultra low carbon energy that it can't produce because of its status as an island nation with relatively small land mass and limited renewable energy resource. So Arup have been working on a number of hydrogen projects across APAC and around the world, some of which you see here, and do message me if you want to find out a little bit more about those. Clearly, it's growing in its prominence, with both Japan and Korea having recently launched their hydrogen strategies to significantly grow a hydrogen economy. In fact, this year's Olympics was to have been the hydrogen Olympics had not COVID got in the way. And at the southern edge of APAC, Australia has some of the cheapest land and most abundant solar resource anywhere in the world, making it the ideal opportunity for shipping sunshine north through the medium of hydrogen. So to set the wider context of global collaboration at COP26, I'll now hand over to the High Commissioner, Cara Owen. Over to you, Cara.
Many thanks, Thomas, and many thanks, Tim, for kicking off the webinar. I'm really, really pleased to be part of it, and I'm really conscious that following me are some genuine experts on hydrogen. So I think what I would like to do in this is to set a bit of context and to use some UK examples for the kind of things we are doing, because it is my job to bring attention to some of those things, and also to talk about potential for collaboration, including with Singapore, where, as so often in areas of innovation, we and Singapore are massively ramping up our interest in issues at exactly the same time. And as two highly skilled, research heavy nations, there's an awful lot we could and should be doing together. I'm really pleased that you focused on hydrogen, BritCham, as part of your Road to Net Zero campaign. I think it's a fantastic campaign that you're pushing now. It really speaks to what people are thinking about and trying to prepare for in the future. And I am particularly pleased because it entirely matches one of my own strategic priorities and my team's strategic priorities for the High Commission and the UK government here in Singapore. So Thomas, you mentioned COP26, and many of the people on the line will already know that the UK, in partnership with Italy, has been appointed as the incoming president of the UN climate talks, COP26 as we call it for short, which will take place in Glasgow next year. I think Glasgow is going to be a really pivotal moment for us to enhance the global ambition to combat climate change. In many ways, I think Paris, I was there in Paris in 2015 when the world descended on Paris for those negotiations, remade our world and has fundamentally shifted how companies and governments are making their calculations about risk, about the pace with which they need to do things, but we're still off track. So we need to use Glasgow to make sure that we send a similar kind of lightning bolt through the way people are thinking about the need to take action on climate and on carbon reduction in the way that Paris totally reframed the game. As part of our presidency of COP, the UK has launched 5 global campaigns to drive real world action. So on the one part, we've got all of the negotiations that we need to kick forward, but we've also selected 5 areas that we think if we can actually mobilize some really strong and concerted action internationally, that is going to help us make a real difference. One of those campaigns is the energy transition. To meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, the global transition to clean power needs to progress 4 times faster than it is doing at the moment. 4 times. To me, that is really, really sobering. And that is after the game-changing discussions in Paris and an awful lot of activity by companies and by governments. And it's a kind of burning platform. If we're talking about energy, it's a burning platform that we really need to be mindful of. To meet this challenge, we're going to have really strong engagement by governments to accelerate the energy transition, and to have countries ramp up their nationally determined contributions and set very clear net zero commitments. Front and centre of our energy campaign is the acceleration of the global transition from coal to renewable energy. That is a dialogue that many of the people on the webinar will be familiar with, I hope. But developing core technologies like carbon capture, utilisation and storage will be integral to helping us make carbon neutral economies a reality. Turning to hydrogen, the topic of the webinar today, the idea of producing energy from hydrogen is obviously not new to us, but I think that the world is waking up rather quickly, as we'll see in this session, to the fact that a fully low carbon hydrogen system can play a game-changing role in long-term decarbonisation plans. If we're ambitious, agile and courageous, scaling up hydrogen can be a key part of our green recovery post-COVID as well. The Hydrogen Council estimates a future hydrogen and equipment market worth $2.5 trillion globally by 2015, equating to 30 million jobs. And in the UK, we estimate it could unlock 75,000 jobs by 2035. So if companies and governments are seeking to unlock future growth and to make sure that they are the companies that are creating jobs, the energy transition and hydrogen is a really tasty prospect. The UK is a leader in clean growth. We were the first to embed climate reduction commitments into law through the Climate Change Act in 2008. And more recently, we were the first G7 country to set a legally binding target of achieving net zero emissions across the economy by 2050. We recognise the potential of clean hydrogen to meet our Paris commitments. We've got the right fundamentals in place to scale up production and infrastructure, including a foundation of expertise born out of an experienced gas and chemical industry. They have the skill set to help us manage the transition to hydrogen. Many of you will also be aware that the UK has the largest offshore wind capacity in the world, which can of course be leveraged for clean hydrogen production. And that's why the UK Hydrogen Task Force, a coalition of hydrogen industries' largest organisation, was set up last year to support the development of the sector and to provide clear recommendations to government for what it can do to unleash this transition. In February this year, our government announced a £90 million package to tackle emissions from homes and heavy industry, including funding 2 of Europe's first ever large-scale low-carbon hydrogen production plants, the first on the banks of the Mersey and the second planned for near Aberdeen. A third project will develop technology to harness offshore wind off the Grimsby coast to produce hydrogen. The UK government is also facilitating a suite of ongoing feasibility and testbed projects, helping to scale up production, distribution and to transition industry sectors such as heating and transport, more details of which I know you're going to hear from John, who is representing BEIS, and also Nigel of the Scottish Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association. We're already seeing progress on the ground, particularly in the transport sector, where the UK has a long history of leadership in innovation and manufacturing. Currently, Aberdeen has Europe's largest fleet of hydrogen buses. Transport for London will be introducing the world's first double-decker hydrogen buses this year. I would absolutely love it if we saw these on the streets of Singapore, being a bit of a bus fiend myself. The exciting Hydroflex project, based out of Birmingham University, recently secured funding for mainline testing of the world's first bi-mode electric hydrogen train that can run on electricity where the track has been electrified, or hydrogen where it has not. So all ambassadors claim that their country is in some way leading the way. That's partly our job. But I think in sitting here today, I feel really confident. We've got independent evidence to back up this claim. According to Bloomberg, the UK has a hydrogen project pipeline that is greater than the rest of the world combined when you measure the amount of carbon dioxide saved. But of course, it's not all about what we're doing domestically. We're really keen, and the point of this webinar is to see what we can do to really accelerate the numbers and value of international collaboration that we are engaging in. On a commercial level, many of our leading UK engineering consultancies like Arup, for whom Thomas works, are doing tons of work around the world and in the region on hydrogen. Other UK companies such as BP, who you'll be hearing from later, Johnson Matthey and Logan Energy are partnering with companies around the world, offering excellent opportunities for shared learning. And we're also collaborating with countries to drive innovation so that we can scale up low carbon hydrogen. An example is through Mission Innovation. This is a global initiative working to accelerate clean energy innovation. Mission Innovation drives sustained public investment and couples it with business leadership across the world with the objective of bringing fledgling ideas into the mainstream at a more rapid pace. More widely, the UK is supporting Southeast Asia in its transition to clean energy in other ways. I am responsible for running a clean energy, low carbon energy programme across ASEAN. It's worth £15 million, and we're supporting green finance and energy efficiency transitions across the region under this programme. In addition to that, there is £13 million being spent on the Mentari UK-Indonesia Low Carbon Energy Partnership. We're supporting Indonesia to become a renewable energy superpower by harnessing its abundant solar, wind and other clean technology potential to drive sustainable economic growth. And I think seeing what's happening to our economies and the fact that we really are having to rethink where we are basing our attention in terms of future jobs and growth, there's no better time than now, even though it feels difficult economically, for us to think in some really big and challenging thoughts and for driving new partnerships. So I'm really excited to hear what the other panelists say. Like I say, they are genuine experts, and I really hope that not only is this an interesting opportunity for us to share some thoughts, but you would really, really want us to see some active and pragmatic partnership being born in this webinar and in follow-up. So with that, I'll hand you back to Thomas.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Good to see the flag flying for the UK and collaboration with Singapore. So to hear a little bit more about some of those exciting projects that the UK are looking at, I'd now like to hand over to John Saltmarsh. John, over to you.
Right, thanks very much, Thomas. Thanks, Cara. I don't think I've met a bus fiend before, so that's one I will store away for the future. Thank you. Now, hopefully, if I can just share my screen, we should have a presentation coming up. Right, can I just confirm people can see that, Thomas?
Yes, we can see that.
Brilliant. Okay, right, well, thank you everyone. I'm John Saltmarsh. I'm the Deputy Director for Engineering and Research within our Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And I suppose I've been involved in hydrogen one way or another for about 7 years. When I joined the department, there was one person who was working on hydrogen. And now we have 3 fairly large teams working on it. And I would imagine that the number of people who are sort of involved in hydrogen into a reasonable degree is probably now into 3 figures. So there's been a huge transformation over the course of the last 7 years. And very much looking forward today to telling you a little bit about some of the things that are going on in the UK. And really with a view to showing the opportunities that could perhaps be applied in Singapore as well. So back to the history. 2008, the UK was the first country to sign up a legally binding target to cut carbon emissions. And at that point, we decided that we could cut carbon emissions by 80% of the 1990 levels by 2050. And that sort of target has sort of continued up until last year, when the Committee on Climate Change, who were established to keep the government honest and track how well they were doing towards meeting their climate change targets, produced a report basically saying that you could now deliver a net zero, i.e. 100% reduction in emissions for the same price as you could originally, when you signed up in 2008, have delivered a 80% reduction. And so this resulted in the latter part of 2019 in a amendment to the Climate Change Act. And the amendment is actually the very last line on the page that you can see on the right-hand side, which simply says replace 80% with 100%. And that's what the net zero target is now saying, that we need to reduce our emissions from 1990 levels to 100% by 100%. So over the last sort of 12 years now, the UK has made great sort of progress as far as this is concerned. We've actually cut our emissions by something like 40% over 1990 targets already. And GDP growth up until COVID had increased by about 2/3 over the same time. So what we've actually seen is a decoupling between carbon emissions and GDP, which is probably the first time in an industrialized country that that's actually happened since the Industrial Revolution. On to the next slide. If you look at different sectors, however, you see considerably different sort of performance. The big success story has been the power industry, where we have seen an amazing reduction in emissions over the last 12 years. A lot of that has been driven by a switch from coal to natural gas, but in the more recent past, there's been a dramatic switch from fossil fuel power to renewables, particularly offshore wind, which is now, on some days accounting for well over 50% of our electricity use. However, the message has been sort of rather more mixed in other sectors. We've seen sort of significant reductions in industry, and waste is a much smaller market, but again, we've seen some good reductions there. But buildings have really sort of remained sort of stubbornly high, and areas like sort of shipping, aviation, and surface transport have shown a decline, but really very little compared to where we need to go. So I think the answer is, we are on the way, but there's a lot further to go, and we have more work to do. And as it stands at the moment, other areas have got to take up a lot more of the burden if we're going to meet our targets. This provides a little bit of sort of a illustration of where we think hydrogen can actually play. I mean, the interesting change from going from net zero to, I beg your pardon, from going from 80% to a net zero target was hydrogen became a far more important part of the overall picture. And really that's because net zero leaves nowhere to hide. Power, buildings, transport and industry have got to get close to zero. And what we were seeing before is that all the difficult bits were being left as well, this will be part of the 20% we don't actually deliver. And when you start eating into that 20%, you find hydrogen has a much more important role to play, either as an energy carrier, or as a way of providing balancing of the energy system. It's really become an integral part of our thinking for the future. I guess it's fairly clear that we don't have all the answers at the moment, but hydrogen is seen as a sort of a leading solution in areas where electrification is particularly challenging. And as far as industry is concerned, we see that particularly in the very sort of high temperature processes, where we're using natural gas at the moment to generate high temperature heat, and hydrogen looks a good option there. Similarly in heavy transport, where it looks challenging to actually to decarbonize using batteries because the energy density isn't great enough. So for maritime, potentially for HGVs and rail and buses, all great opportunities there for hydrogen to play a role in transport. And then there are the sort of the question marks. The big programs that are going on at the moment in the UK are actually exploring hydrogen for heating in buildings, either as a sort of peak heating need to meet peak heating needs, as part of a sort of mixture of heat pumps and hydrogen boilers for peak heat, and also in dispatchable power. The big problem with renewables is, what do you do when the wind isn't blowing? And that's probably okay for a day because you can use your stored your sort of stores of energy. But if you're going beyond a day, then really you need some form of dispatchable low carbon power, and that seems to be where hydrogen offers great opportunities. From an industrial sector perspective, we have a number of sort of clusters that have been identified where hydrogen either is playing quite a part at the moment, in the form of hydrogen is being used, although not low carbon, or there are areas where there is a huge amount of industry where they feel that there is great opportunity for decarbonising using hydrogen. And the UK is sort of structuring its, its support to this around these clusters, and it's supporting in different ways each of the approaches that's going on in these industrial areas. I'll leave you to sort of read the slides in slower time, given how much time we've got to sort of go through this. But certainly we're sort of recognising that hydrogen is going to be very much sort of place dependent, and you need to look at and see, what industry is there and how can you build a picture using hydrogen that joins all the various assets together in a particular cluster to get the best solution. A number of challenges across the value chain. A big question really is how much hydrogen can actually reduce our emissions, and in particular when we're looking at carbon capture use and storage. What are the capture rates? What is the sort of the leakage of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases coming out of the system? And what are the upstream residual emissions? Because clearly, if we're heading towards net zero, then it's not going to work if you're losing 20% of your emissions through leakage in carbon capture and storage. Then as far as the production is concerned, key issues here are probably around cost and in particular actually around build rates. Can we achieve the level of transformation we need to achieve by 2050? On the distribution side, the big question is, what do we do with the gas grid? The UK has a huge gas grid that currently supplies energy to about 85% of the buildings in the UK. The challenge is going to be, can we actually use that with hydrogen, and do we want to for the future? And particularly if we're reducing the amount of hydrogen that's being used, what's the future of the gas grid? So there's a lot of work going on there. And I've sort of mentioned storage already, but if you're trying to balance renewables, you're probably talking about terawatt hours of storage, which is a huge amount. And we have sort of great sort of salt caverns or salt fields where we can hollow out salt caverns, which will store sort of significant amounts of hydrogen. But when you're talking about terawatts or even tens of terawatt hours, you may well be having to look at using depleted oil fields or depleted gas fields, putting hydrogen into those areas. So there's sort of research going on there. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the works going on end use in a minute. So these are some of the projects that we've got going as far as innovation funding is is concerned at the moment. And we've sort of divided our innovation funding into production, storage, distribution, and end use. And you can see we've got programs that are sort of covering all the various areas. We've got, I'll talk about the hydrogen production ones later. We've got a number of programs looking at sort of distribution and questions about, can you blend hydrogen as a way of getting from where we are at the moment to where we need to be. And we have projects that are looking at the sort of future infrastructure and what we need to do as far as that's concerned. So wide range of projects. And the big thing about most of this work is it's not just paper studies now. People are actually doing work on the ground. We're producing hydrogen boilers that actually still operate on hydrogen. We're blending hydrogen into the gas grid. We're producing electrolyzers and connecting them up to renewable plant and distributing the hydrogen to demonstrate that all of these components actually work on the ground rather than simply more and more studies. This is the High for Heat program. And key points that we're looking at here is to produce products for the future. So we are producing at the moment hydrogen cookers, we're producing hydrogen boilers, and we're producing hydrogen fires to demonstrate that you can actually convert, in effect, a methane burner into a hydrogen burner. I'm conscious I've got very little time left, so I will actually skip through what's going on in the hydrogen supply competition and just bring us to the sort of the key points at the end. That we really see there are four sort of main areas that we need to focus on. One of which is sort of developing our key strategic approach for the future. Secondly, is the policy frameworks that are going to be needed to support hydrogen. Is it that we're going to support production, or are we going to drive deployment? It's a key question here is the one of the chicken and egg, and which comes first. And that's an area that there's a lot of work going on at the moment. And I've already mentioned some of the funding that's going into the hydrogen projects. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, I think just about on time. So thank you very much. And I do look forward to the question and answer session that's to follow. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Exciting set of projects there in the UK, and certainly some opportunities for collaboration with Singapore. Talking of which, I'd now like to hand over to Professor Chan, who will enlighten us a little bit more on what's happening in Singapore. Over to you, Professor.
Professor, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see it, Professor.
Thanks. Very good afternoon to all of you. My name is S.H. Chan. I'm from Nanyang Technological University. I'd like to share with you the hydrogen and fuel cell activities in Singapore. So I want to start with giving you some background. Okay, the rationale behind the hydrogen economy, in my opinion, came from two important drivers. One on energy security, while the other one is on the sustainability. Today's focus is on the sustainability. For Singapore to be internationally recognized for its decarbonization effort, the target is to achieve 21 to 33 million tons of carbon generation annually by 2050, which means that we have to reduce about 18.2 to 30.2 million tons of CO2 from 2017's level. So here you can see that, based on IPCC assessment report 5 on the 30% mark as well as a 15% mark, this will come up with this number, 21 to 33 million tons. So last year at the Singapore International Energy Week, ministers of MTI, Mr. Tan Jun Sing, shared Singapore's story. he started with 4 tabs, which addresses our water's technology issue, to 4 switches that is related to our future energy need. These 4 switches is actually corresponding to 4 strategy, on the energy efficiency, renewable energy, energy management, as well as the alternative energy. The first switch is natural gas. 95% of Singapore electricity is generated using natural gas, which is the cleanest fossil fuels of today. And natural gas will continue to be a dominant fuel in the next 50 years, right? So while we are scaling up our other switches. So government will help the GenCo to improve the efficiency, right, of their power plant. So we will continue to use natural gas. The second switch is solar. Singapore's most promising renewable source. Well, we have a very poor kind of wind powers. Our wind speed on an average basis is less than 2 meters per second, which is trivial. So compared to wind, solar stood up more prominently. Our first target is 350 megawatt peak by 2020. Actually, is now we are on track. The second target is actually the 2 gigawatt peaks by 2030. And the energy storage deployment target will be 200 megawatt beyond 2025. The third switch is a regional power grid. We will explore way to tap on the regional power grid to access the energy that is more cost competitive. This could be realized through a bilateral collaboration or the regional kind of initiative. The last one is what we are going to discuss today is, the low carbon alternative, more specifically the hydrogen and CCUS. So you can see a 2 pathway here, the brown color one and the green color one. The brown one is the existing energy pathway. We start from, import the petroleum products as well as the crude oil. And after processing, it becomes the refined chemical. And of course, it generates the CO2. On the other hand, we use a lot of natural gas mainly for power generation, and it produces CO2 as well. Another application of the natural gas is through the natural gas reformings to produce the hydrogens, and the hydrogen is mixed with the natural gas and use it for home cooking, right? And the green color one is a potential decarbonization or low carbon pathway. What you can see here that because of limited renewable energy that we have, so we will rely on import hydrogen from overseas, preferably from ASEAN country and Australia. So the hydrogen can be in the form of a liquid hydrogen or organic hydrates or even ammonia, right? On the other hand, as I mentioned that natural gas will be continuous as our main source of fuel in the next 50 years. We will derive the hydrogens from natural gas through a process called pyrolysis, right? Or we call it natural gas cracking, producing the hydrogens and the solid carbon concurrently. So of course, the carbon has a lot of application. Like for example, you can use it in a tire, it can be used in a road or the construction materials. So apart from this, the hydrogen that we produce will be used, in the power generation, through a process, through the so-called HENG, hydrogen enhanced natural gas, and burn it in the gas turbine. And on the other hand, we will work on the carbon captures as well as utilization, converting the CO2 into chemical products. So these are some of the studies, and this has been presented to Scientific Advisory Board of National Research Foundation recently. And there are 3 studies here. The first studies include the test beddings of a hydrogen import using different carrier, more specifically ammonia, MCH, as well as the liquid hydrogen. And the next one will be on the regeneration of the hydrogen, like crackings of ammonias, MCH, regasification of the liquid hydrogen. On the methane pyrolysis part, we will use this to kickstart the hydrogen economy. And hydrogens and the carbon productions are integrated, right? So this enables the combined values to achieve a lower cost. And more importantly, at the end of the day, is still the cost matters. And then the third one will be a downstream application, including use it in the gas-fired power plant and the CCU. On the carbon capture part, you will look into the MOF, metal organics framework and membrane separation technology. And on the utilization, we will look into the CO2 to fuel, right? Converting more specifically to methanol as well as kerosene. And next will be the CO2 to the aggregate, natural kind of a mineralization to create a non-structural building materials. Now I'd like to share with you some of the activities in Singapore. So this paper was published in 2016, a little bit outdated, and it's actually an update version from the one that published in 2006 in Fuel Cell Bulletin. And this paper is actually in International Journal of Hydrogen Energy. The title is Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Technology, Research, Development and Demonstration Activities in Singapore. It's actually a country report. So there are some, actually these were excerpted from that papers that what we would like to highlight is two major investments that Singapore has made. One is 100 million US dollars of investment into Rolls-Royce fuel cell on the solid oxide fuel cell development in 2005. Another one is in 2015, an investment in Intelligent Energy, which is another British company. So we also hosted two international conferences. We actually ran the first World Hydrogen Technologies Convention back in 2005. And 2 years ago, in 2018, we organized Hypothesis 13, which stands for Hydrogen Power Theoreticals and Engineering Solution International Symposium. In 2018's May, I actually is representing NTU to sign MOU to promote the hydrogen economy with China's, Korea's, Japan's, and Korea's Hydrogen Association. So we hope this will become, a network for us to promote the hydrogen society. So you can see that just now the paper captures the information up to 2016, and I extend it to 2000. You can see that these are the major activities that are related to hydrogens and fuel cell. And I would like to highlight this, that there was the studies on hydrogen import and downstream application for Singapore and commissioned by PMO. So yeah, I think time's up. And I'd like to share that my hydrogen journey started with the collaboration with British Gas on natural gas reformings. And since then, we have been working on different types of hydrogen generation technology as well as the fuel cell technology. And lately that we are putting in a lot of effort on methane cracking process. We also have a spin-off. This is my last slide. A spin-off company making the key components for the PEM fuel cell. And you can see here that Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat actually visited my companies last year in Guangzhou. That's all about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Very exciting set of activities happening here in Singapore, and clearly lots of opportunity for collaboration. And also thank you to the audience for sending in your questions. They're already coming in, so do like those ones that you're particularly interested in. Right, well now we'll hand over to someone in the oil and gas industry. So I'll hand over to Andreas Prosinecki. Andreas, over to you. We can see your slides, Andreas, but you're on mute. If you could unmute yourself, Andreas.
There we go. Sorry, I was struggling a little bit there with my screen froze. So welcome everybody. Andreas Prosinecki is my name. I'm the Senior Strategy Advisor for BP Australia, tagged to the sales and marketing business and focused at the moment on a number of alternative energy projects, including hydrogen as it pertains to the Australian market, and working on one of the major projects that we've got going on in Australia, which I'm really excited to tell you all about later. But thought I'd open up a little bit with sort of a background about hydrogen, because hydrogen in the oil and gas industry is not a new energy vector. There's a lot of excitement going on at the moment, but we've been working with hydrogen for 50 years in our refining business as an input and output. In fact, we used to sell hydrogen to some of our collaborators like BOC, and got a lot of experience with hydrogen all the way back to the early 2000s, where we actually ran a global pilot, tagged with Singapore as one of the destinations, as well as the US and Australia, into FCEV refueling stations. But I think the difference between some of these false dawns of the past and what's happening now is just the real alignment of government, the clean energy net zero agenda, and also the shareholder pressures that some of our companies, as well as our end users, are facing. So the amount of activity and the exciting partnerships that are being struck up around the world in the mobility space, in the industrial and mining sector, which are some of the companies that are some of the fastest moving in this space, as they aim to decarbonize production with the use of hydrogen in both their power plants and the mobile plant, yellow goods section of their businesses, as well as export projects looking to ship sunshine from Australia to destinations such as Japan, Singapore, and Korea. It's really an exciting time. So I think I'm using BP as an example, but there are a number of our other companies in this sector that also have net zero agendas and are really actively looking at decarbonising. I won't go through the entire strategy. I'll just point out that I think that the real key levers that we're looking at here is obviously net zero to our operations, and then halving the carbon intensity of the products that we sell. So that's not going to be possible unless we're selling clean or products with zero carbon. And as such, there are obviously a couple of key levers that we've got to play with, which include offsets, sequestration, and hydrogen. So being a fundamental pillar of our strategy, as well as the strategy of a number of the oil majors, you really get the confidence that this is really going to happen, and this is really a target that we can achieve. If we look at the projections of where we see hydrogen consumption globally going forward out to 2050, we see that we're starting from today from a really low base, but within an ambition to get to between 6 and 16% hydrogen consumption as part of the total energy mix. And if we look at what the breakdown of that is estimated to be, transportation is going to account for roughly about 20% of that, which means a lot of it is going to come from industrial uses, so feedstock or some of those other high intensity industries, which means it is a total hydrogen economic solution. It's not just an oil and gas sector that's shifting across, but there's collaborators from all industries that are going to be partaking in the hydrogen economy if this is where we're going to end up. In terms of where it's expected to be consumed, I guess no real surprise that China and some of the other Asian, African sort of economies are likely to be high users of hydrogen going forward. In terms of, Thomas touched on, and a number of you have touched on the two different pathways for hydrogen. Obviously, green hydrogen is the expected long-term solution because it has the potential to get down to the lowest cost. What's needed to happen there is obviously that the electrolyzer componentry and also the renewable, so the PV or the wind power capital costs need to come down. And until that takes place, which is expected to be around 2030, could be the sort of crossover that's being projected. Blue hydrogen has a major role to play as a transition to enable hydrogen to be used in the interim until green really becomes commercial. Up until that point, it's going to be very difficult to see green playing a dominant role. Having said that, which pathway of hydrogen is going to be largely dependent on the feedstock availability of where in the world are you and what resources do you have available to enable generation of clean hydrogen. So the renewable resource is obviously going to be key. Where we're sitting in Australia, we have really strong renewable resource, and therefore green hydrogen is largely going to be preferred. And also, I guess, aligned to that is the importance of policy incentives and subsidies to get some of these really expensive, high capital cost, and at this point, not commercial projects off the ground. The consumption hubs are likely to be the EU and Northeast Asia, with Australia and the Middle East likely to be providing and exporting hydrogen into those locations through various energy carriers. In terms of the types of applications that we're seeing as early adoption and most likely to take the majority of the demand for hydrogen, heavy transport's been mentioned before. Obviously, there are a number of characteristics of hydrogen as a fuel that gives it an advantage position relative to electrification, especially in countries such as Australia, where we're traveling large distances, hauling large amounts of product, which means that the weight penalty that you face from electrification is significant, which means that the hydrogen trucking, long distance buses, rail, and also potentially shipping are likely to be applications that attract a large amount of hydrogen input. The other thing that's unique to Australia is these large industrial clusters, such as the mining industry in the Pilbara or the gold fields, where it's likely that you can deploy scale hydrogen production at scale, and therefore service that region, because transporting, while hydrogen is much preferred to, say, electricity in the way that it's able to be transported, that's still going to be the logistics of getting it across a country the size of Australia is going to be significantly prohibitive. The other one I want to really touch on is export, which obviously the ability to ship renewable energy requires some significant technology or supply chains to be proved out. So whether it's done through liquid hydrogen carriers, as some projects are investigating, or using ammonia as a carrier to get it across the ocean, that then requires the conversion back into hydrogen if that was the end use application. So that still has to be proved out that's commercially viable. In terms of the locations, it's no secret that it's Australia, China, the US, and then Europe that we're focusing on strategically. Touching on Australia, I want to talk about one of the major projects that we've undertaken to start here as BP. We're working collaboratively together with ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Organisation. as well as Lightsource BP, to develop a feasibility study into a hydrogen production facility and ammonia synthesis plant. Built in 2 phases, looking to ship across to Asia and to Japan and Korea. I'll skip ahead because I'm running out of time. There's a lot of projects going on. I won't touch on them. You can read the slides later, but billions and billions of dollars are being pledged to large-scale domestic and export production facilities. But I think what's key is that there are a number of challenges, technical and commercial, at the moment to make hydrogen a reality. From the technical perspective, we believe these are all manageable solutions. Obviously, the scaling up of some of these plants, so electrolysis, electrolyzers, they're currently manufactured at small scale and handmade in factories that are now being automated. But we believe that those are all manageable, and it's really the commercial sides or the commercial challenges, such as bringing the vehicle costs down, which will happen with scale and as the supply chain and production gets more automated and scale numbers come up. But the sort of chicken and the egg nature of infrastructure and refueling stations, distribution costs for long distances in Australia, and some of the shipping challenges are all causing at the moment hydrogen to be commercially not viable and needing to be solved going forward. So subsidies and partnerships are going to play a really key role in ensuring that the cost curves come down and we succeed. But it's certainly an exciting future, and I think we're on this journey, and it's really exciting. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Andreas. So just before we move on to Nigel Holmes, I realise that Cara has to go to a ministerial briefing shortly. So, High Commissioner, have you got any thoughts for us and any questions that you might, or challenges you might add for the Q&A session? You're on mute at the moment.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So really fascinating presentations, where I think what really strikes me is just the pace and the momentum that is existing around the kind of development of commercial options, but also massive amounts of investment in research. I think for me, working out when we go through the rest of the discussion, the areas where actually strengths, there are complementary strengths between Singapore and the UK in the research field to help us guide us into the next stage, and being really clear about how that links into what industry is doing. So I think Singapore and the UK have a really good track record of integrating both deep research with commercial development of commercial applications kind of almost simultaneously. So that is the question that I've got in my mind. And also thinking as well about some of the questions around some of the key sectors that could make use of this technology if only we could get to that point safely and cheaply, including, for example, shipping, and having 2 major maritime centres in the UK and Singapore. That's something that I'd really like to start thinking about. Thank you so much for inviting me. Really
Great.
Interesting.
Thank you very much for joining. Right, so thank you to the speakers so far. Our last speaker is Nigel Holmes of the Scottish Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you, Thomas. Let me just share my screen. And that should be on the first slide. Is that okay?
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Excellent. So good afternoon, Singapore. Greetings from Scotland. And what I'd like to do in 10 minutes with a lot of slides is to just go through basically what's happening in Scotland, the context, and give you some examples of projects that are happening and how we're looking to develop the the hydrogen economy with a mixture of hydrogen supply, infrastructure, and demand. Very quickly about the association, this is just some of our members. We've got over 100 active members, plus many more associates. And together, we're actually helping to build Scotland's hydrogen economy. Why are we doing this? Well, I think it's been already said very clearly. We have climate change. We need to have rapid action. We don't have that much time to do it. John's already mentioned the Committee on Climate Change, and they gave us some very stretch targets for Scotland. You'll see them here in terms of not just the 100% by 2050, but actually 5 years earlier in Scotland. Why? Because Scotland's blessed with a lot of renewables, and they believe this is achievable. We've already seen the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Again, similar to the rest of the UK, we've had more than 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we've also seen the reduction in the the greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. And this is very much the similar kind of charts that John used. But the point I'd like to just mention is that for Scottish electricity generation, we're now well under 50 grams per kilowatt hour for the electricity generation in Scotland, largely due to renewables, but we do still have some legacy nuclear. So this is very much about the energy transition. The High Commissioner, you mentioned this earlier, about the importance of making this happen quicker. We've closed down all of the coal power stations, last one closed over 4 years ago, and we're now putting up a lot of renewables. This is just a chart showing some of the growth of renewables. I need to get the latest version to show you where we are now, but I think you'll get the picture. The level of renewables in Scotland is going up very, very quickly. But this is only part of the picture. Decarbonising electricity is important, but we also have transport and heat representing about a half of Scotland's final energy demand, and transport about a quarter. So the other challenge that we have to consider is with heat in particular in Scotland, it's not always that warm in the winter. And what you see here is the chart that shows the annual variation of energy demand for heat, power and transport from over the year. And you can see the light green shows clearly the seasonal demand for heat in the winter goes up by a lot. So just to put this in context, I'd like to take you through some of the projects that we've delivered in Scotland, starting with the very north of Scotland, the Orkney Islands, where they're already more than self-sufficient in electrical supply from renewables. In fact, they have more renewables than they can cope with on many days. And because of that, there's been projects already developed looking at taking constrained renewables, community wind turbines on the islands of Edy and Chappensea, and actually converting that into hydrogen, moving it down to the mainland of Orkney, where it's used for heat, transport and power. And this is just one of the projects that's been underway, Surf and Turf, which developed into the Big Hit project. And we can see the ferry behind you, which is used to bring the hydrogen from the islands down to the port of Kirkwall. In Kirkwall as well, I just thought I'd mention this one, is we're also looking at the applications in heat. And John might, in the questions, take a question about the Green Distilleries competition that Bayes has just opened. And transport, we talked about, we've heard comments about planes, buses. In Orkney, they're actually doing some trials of a plane running on hydrogen, electric fuel cell plane this year. And the key thing here is that aviation emissions are becoming increasingly important in terms of how we achieve net zero. Shipping's been mentioned. Well, we're not quite shipping, but we're moving people and goods around the Orkney Islands using ferries. We already have the ferry on the right, the Hydyne project, which is partly decarbonised with the auxiliary power, the fuel cell ferry on the left. Moving down to Fife, the Hydrogen Office was actually opened in 2011, and since then it's been the home to a number of projects, including the first waste collection vehicle running on hydrogen, and moving on to in Fife, the H100 project has also been one of the next steps that we're going to be carrying out with developing a hydrogen network for up to 300 houses. And this is going to be an important step in the evidence for the wider decarbonisation of the UK gas networks. Fife, just north of Edinburgh, beautiful location in terms of a mixture of potential offshore, onshore renewables, domestic and industrial demand. Aberdeen, so you heard Aberdeen mentioned previously, one of the first locations for buses in the hydrogen buses in the UK. London was first, then Aberdeen. This is the fleet in Aberdeen. The buses are about to be joined by a new fleet of double-decker buses. So as well as London, we'll have them running around in Aberdeen very shortly. Aberdeen is also host to fuel cell combined heat and power. This is a big exhibition centre just outside Aberdeen. And this is a Doosan project. And it actually does provide hydrogen as well, which could be used for transport. Aberdeen has got a legacy of oil and gas. And the key thing about Aberdeen is how we can start to use that legacy of experience, skills and assets to actually start to build the hydrogen supply in the area. And a key part of this will be, we've heard discussion about green and blue. So blue hydrogen using carbon capture storage is essentially the Acorn project at St Fergus, just north of Aberdeen. So that goes through stages of building up the storage and then starting to also have the potential to bring in CO2 from other locations around the UK or Europe to actually offer that facility for CO2 sequestration. It's building on existing assets, pipelines, facility at St Fergus. So it's very much about the energy transition from oil and gas to low carbon. So just to wrap up, where do we go from here? And the key thing is that as well as the existing assets, there is a massive potential for offshore wind. There's a comment earlier about the EU being potentially a large demand hub, but could be sort of a bit constrained on space. Well, the great thing is in Scotland, we've got plenty of space and fantastic offshore wind potential. A recent study indicates that we've got potentially 735 gigawatts of offshore wind economically viable potential. And what does this mean? Well, it means we can join together the offshore wind, the repurposing of oil and gas assets to really start to drive forward the supply and the infrastructure for hydrogen. This gives us, in turn, the potential to start to meet some of the demands for industry and heat at scale. And some of the questions that have come up have been about, how do you actually start to, sort of use this effectively? Storage, and this will be a key element of taking this forward. Geological storage, potentially in old oil and gas fields, and there's work going on in Edinburgh with references you can follow here. And the other key thing is about using infrastructure to join the production and the demand together. So the chart you see here is from the Hydrogen Europe project. The yellow lines are essentially the hydrogen backbone pipelines that could be built to join together supply and demand throughout Europe. So very much about the infrastructure. And so the key message I'd like to leave you with is that Scotland is already learning by doing, and we want to now move to leading by example. The key thing about the hydrogen economy is that we need supply, we need the infrastructure, and we need the demand. And to actually build it, we need to do it with both green and blue hydrogen. If we do it well, this is what we should end up with. So we're transitioning to the future energy system. And I hope that we'll be seeing you in Glasgow in November 2021. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Nigel. That was an incredible number of slides in your 10 minutes there. Very impressive. So I shall be reading those with interest when I get a chance. And thank you to all speakers and to you, the audience, for sending in some of your questions. I'll just launch straight into those and ask various different speakers to talk on those. I won't ask you all to answer each question, as there are quite a few and we want to try and get through it. But one thing that I will ask you all for your very brief thoughts on is hydrogen's obviously looking, Singapore's obviously looking at a variety of different carriers for hydrogen. And are there some lessons learnt that are happening in the UK and actually in Australia with BP, Andreas, that you think Singapore should consider? So maybe if I can put that one to you, Andreas, first, and then I'll ask others.
Yeah, so as I sort of didn't get the chance to talk to, but there are a number of projects currently working on looking at proving up that supply chain. So in terms of how do we transport the renewable energy? So the two most, I guess, anticipated are ammonia. So bubbling the hydrogen into ammonia and then shipping it on containers, or liquid hydrogen, which comes with a lot of challenges because of the volume of hydrogen that you have to ship and the temperatures you have to get it down to. So to avoid having the volume, you have to get it down to almost zero, absolute zero to liquefy it. So there's a project, the HESC project in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, really looking at that supply chain to prove up. It's led by Marubeni, Iwatomi, and Kawasaki to test that supply chain. They're looking at a liquid hydrogen ship. So they'll be pretty close to actually getting the results from that project this year or early next year. So that might be one to keep your eye on.
Yeah, thank you. John, are there any thoughts that the UK have been looking at in terms of transportation of hydrogen and potentially export of hydrogen from the UK?
I guess most of the UK's focus at the moment has been internally on how do we transport hydrogen by pipeline. We're watching what's going on in the Australia, Japan axis with transporting by ship with interest, and there's a number of options there, as Andreas mentioned. I mean, the other one that's perhaps further off, but might be more, assuming the technology actually works, is liquid organic hydrogen carriers, and whether there are solutions along those lines. So that we've got research that's going on at the early stages, but when it comes to demonstrations, that's not where our focus is at the moment. Our hope is that by the time we are looking at using large amounts of hydrogen or have significant amounts of surplus hydrogen, there will be solutions that are adopted, but I certainly wouldn't want to be picking a winner at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Well, so we'll be getting it, like we get our renewable electricity, we'll get our hydrogen shipped down from Scotland into the UK with all their excess wind.
Well, the hope is with that we can use the existing gas grid to do that. So,
yes.
The issue is if you're actually importing over continental distances rather than countryside distances.
Yeah. And I wondered, Professor, whether you thought, because you mentioned some of the switches that Singapore are looking at, and one of those being a regional power grid, whether you thought there was a potential for a regional hydrogen grid, or at least a hydrogen connection to some of Singapore's neighbours. You're currently on mute.
Sorry. There is ASEAN network called COSTE, Committees of Science, Technology and Innovation. In particular, there's a focus group called Sustainable Energy Research. And this can be interesting for discussion among all the ASEAN countries. And it is beyond technology. There's a lot of different kind of political agenda behind. But I think that it is timely to discuss two things. One is the power grid, and the other one is the gas rig. well, I think that I totally agree that, we have done a lot of study that if the distance is more than 1,500 kilometers, shipping the hydrogens by vessel is more economical. Shorter than that, we can use the gas pipeline. So knowing that Singapore locations is very close to Malaysia, Indonesia, and also we can consider even Vietnam. Vietnam's rich in renewable energy. From Da Nang and above, you can see that a lot of renewable energy resources that they can actually, especially the offshore wind, they can convert it to the hydrogen and then sell the hydrogens, as one of the business. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question about why we're focusing on blue hydrogen, which actually came in before Andreas spoke, and I think he did a good job at answering that in his presentation. It's really comes down to price. I did a project in the UK where we were looking at blue hydrogen versus green hydrogen, and it was 3 times the price, even when you included CCS. So when solar gets down, and when offshore wind in, say, Vietnam gets to the stage where it's very cheap and we have surplus supply, then there's lots of potential for green hydrogen, but at the moment it's not commercially viable. And my own personal view is, whatever way we can save carbon, we should do that. Not least also, we can engage the oil and gas industry in blue hydrogen rather easier than we can engage them in green hydrogen, and therefore getting their huge capital expenditure involved in that would be a good thing in my view. So another question that's been asked actually is whether we can, the UK is considering shipping as a potential solution for, or hydrogen as a potential solution for shipping. And given that Singapore is the world's 3rd largest bunkering location, how close do you think, Professor, Singapore is to decarbonising its shipping using hydrogen?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, that maritime industries contribute to 7% of Singapore GDP. So it's a pretty important industry, and we are seriously looking into decarbonization, not just for the shipping, but for the port as well. So we have started some studies and conducted a study with our partners, CSIRO in Australians, and looking into the ammonia application for maritime sectors. The direct firings the ammonias into the internal combustion engine, or use it in the solar oxide fuel cell. Ammonia is not an easy gas to deal with, which is worse than hydrogen. At least hydrogen is odorous, no smell, right? If you look at ammonias, the challenging part is that it is not only explosive, it is corrosive, it is toxic, right? So to handle the ammonia, that we need to do a lot of studies beyond the technology, like for example, how to handle the safety, thing like this. So this is part of the studies with our collaborators, CSIRO. Yeah,
Thank you, Professor. One for you, Nigel. Have you got any particular thoughts on the differences and parallels between Singapore and Scotland?
Well, yes, but I think, as always, the devil's in the detail with these questions. So we absolutely have things in common in terms of the general numbers of population. I think in Singapore is not dissimilar to that in Scotland. We're very much island sort of nature in terms of what we have. But the detail could be around, for example, in Scotland, as I mentioned, the opportunity with offshore wind is looking compelling, and the the trends that we're seeing, and I appreciate your comment about the respective costs of green and blue. All I would say is that this is a fast-moving space, and I'm looking forward to the Wood Mackenzie report that's due out next week, because they seem to be looking at some much more ambitious targets for green hydrogen over a shorter period of time. So I think the point that was mentioned earlier about the opportunities for collaboration between Singapore and Scotland is absolutely right, both in terms of the research collaboration, but also the commercial partnerships. And there are areas where I think Singapore has some fantastic resources. I believe Singapore is actually host to the first fuel cell company in the world to be profitable. Horizon Fuel Cells, I believe, won that accolade a few years back. They're actively working on the development of hydrogen fuel cell trucks. We've got hydrogen fuel cell buses. There has to be some kind of interplay here between the UK and Singapore to actually come out as a win-win situation.
Yeah. And there are, I think, the other big background I would suggest is that although Singapore doesn't have an upstream oil and gas industry like Scotland, obviously it does have a very large oil and gas industry, much like Scotland does. So a number of parallels there. Someone asked a question whether the speaker's slides will be available, and yes, they will, and BritCham will arrange circulation of that after the talk, so please do keep an eye on their website for that. Another question which has come through, actually, I wonder what the panel think Singapore can play in Southeast Asia to facilitate a hydrogen economy. In your work, John, with BEIS and policy looking to stimulate a hydrogen economy, and we've heard lots about the costs of hydrogen versus other forms of fuel. How do you see the UK making a commercial case for hydrogen production, and could Singapore follow suit? And I'll come to you afterwards, Professor, with the same question.
Thank you. I mean, I think the High Commissioners have put it quite well to begin with, that the cost of doing nothing is even worse than the cost of trying to sort of decarbonize. And the costs associated with hydrogen are more significant than continuing to pump large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But we need to look in the round at the overall cost to society and to the planet, and that's where we need to be going. And the big driver, I think, is for nations to show that it can be done. And that's really what the UK is trying to do at the moment, and where Singapore, I believe, could be a leader as well, is demonstrating that some of these technologies work, and that you can base your economy around them. And I think that's probably my driver, is the people who go first are going to get the first mover advantage. But they're also going to be leading the way as far as the rest of the world is concerned. The UK currently only emits about 2% of the world's carbon emissions. So we're not going to change the face of carbon emissions ourselves. But what we can do is show people a pathway and encourage others to go down that route. Yeah,
certainly creating a pathway. Some of the targets in Europe could certainly stimulate it, and we've obviously seen Germany put a big onus on hydrogen recently. And I have heard rumours of the UK considering a feed-in tariff or a contract for difference for hydrogen. I won't ask a government department to comment on that right now, but we've got some time before we get there. But I imagine that might be one way in which it's facilitated. And my own calculations on a project on the Isle of Grain in the UK were that actually the cost needed for a feed-in tariff to fill that gap essentially for gas was would have been less than what the UK put into carbon reduction from offshore wind in the early feed-in tariffs. So there is, there is a pathway for that. Professor Chan, do you think that Singapore might instigate some sort of feed-in tariff or incentive that would make the commercial case for hydrogen production?
Well, we started the carbon tax in 2019, and this actually is, has an impact on oil refineries as well as the power generation. So people started to look into how to mitigate the CO2. One option is CCUS, and Singapore is a very small country. And the dilemma here is that, in order to capture the CO2 and convert it into the useful stuff, you need a hydrogen, unless you use the CO2 without the need of a hydrogen. And hydrogen is expensive, as we all know, and Singapore has a limited renewable energy, and we have to rely on, import the hydrogen from overseas. So this is a dilemma that, if your hydrogen cost is high, why don't you use the hydrogen straight away instead of convert it into other types of fuel, like for example, methane, right? CO2 and the methane. And methane is pretty cheap. Natural gas is pretty cheap. I think currently the natural gas cost is historically low. It's about $2 per MMBTU. So using the expensive hydrogen and convert it into a cheap natural gas or methane, it doesn't make sense unless we convert it into a high value product such as a kerosene, for aerospace industry. So yeah, my point here is that, it's all looking into the economies, and everything's boiled down to the cost, and which is, very challenging for us to, for this part. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that is a big challenge. Andreas, perhaps I could bring you in here and just trying to, other than of course BP's targets and targets of other big oil and gas companies, what do you think will need to be done to trigger a hydrogen economy, and how could that happen in Southeast Asia in particular?
I think it has to be a full value chain solution. So there's not going to be any partners that have the whole value chain all the way from production to end use under their roof. So it's going to be partnerships across, using the best of breed from multiple sources to come together and sort of share that risk in the initial stages where it's potentially not commercial, and you need to kind of build that scale and build that sort of chicken and the egg ecosystem to get those scale economies, both on the component side from a manufacturing perspective, but I think also in the sort of skills and experience in working with the sort of operational aspects. Because I mean, the one thing that we haven't really touched on is also the safety aspect of hydrogen as well, which obviously BP obviously very safety conscious, and we've got experience with working with hydrogen, but it's not without risk. So once again, just I think I'd say partnerships is a key, and potentially subsidies in the initial stages as well to help us along the journey.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that. I just wonder whether anyone has got any thoughts on end-of-life disposal of electrodes and electrolyzers in fuel cells. Has anyone got any view on that? There was a question asked.
I can just make a quick comment there, Thomas. There has been work carried out by the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking as part of their project activities on the recycling of fuel cells. And essentially a fuel cell, because it's made up in a stack, you can take it apart, you can have the metal bits, you can have the plastic bits, and then they can be recycled. So the potential is for a very high recovery rate from fuel cells. And I think a similar approach would also work for electrolyzers. The PEM electrolyzer, in many respects, is a fuel cell just working the other way around. So one, you stick in the hydrogen and the oxygen, the air, you get the power out. The other, you put the power in and you get the hydrogen and the oxygen out. So in terms of recycling and materials recovery, I think you'll find that both have got very, very high recovery potential.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers again, and thank you to you, the audience. We've reached our deadline of 5:30. So yeah, thank you to everyone. Thank you also to BritCham, to IPPF, and to the Energy Institute, and also to the High Commission and the High Commissioner for attending. With that, I think we'll end, and please do get in touch with any of the speakers, and BritCham will of course be posting a set of slides for you all to review at your leisure. I know we went through a lot of information very quickly. So thank you very much, and have a good evening or good rest of your day if you're in the UK. Many thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Tim speaking again. Thank you on behalf of the committee to all of the panelists for joining us. I think that was a tremendous session, lots of collaboration there. I'd also just like to re-emphasize that there are materials on the registration page that you can access on hydrogen if you want more. The replay will be available, and we will try to get the slides available to you as well shortly. There are events coming up. We've got an event on waste to energy on October the 6th, not yet publicised, but please mark your diaries. We've got follow-up events with the Energy Institute on shipping. That's coming up on October the 10th. And then, as I mentioned, carbon capture utilisation is another event we've got planned for later on this year, as well as an event we'll be doing on COP26 at the Singapore International Energy Week. So with all of our partners in Singapore, we're trying to foster more collaboration, more engagement, more synergies between the energy industry, the infrastructure sector, finance, right across BritCham, right across the board. So with that, you can see there are some other events coming up there. We have the awards coming up at the end of the month as well. We look forward to everybody joining us at future BritCham events. Thank you very much. I think that was a tremendous event. Congratulations to everybody, and thank you.